few words about myself. As you could see, probably if you took the bother to read it, most of my career was spent at Bronxville, New York, and in the several hundred miles of the surrounding area doing various aspects of teaching and ministry. And so if I don't sound like somebody who's from the Bronx or from Manhattan or Brooklyn, forgive me. I never picked up the lingo because I remained a Missourian all of my life. And so here I'm back in retirement living in West County, which is about a 25-minute drive from here. And it's a joy to be among you. Okay, let's move then to the other thing that was available in the bookstore to you, which is the course management policy statement. And as you move to the first page after the foreword, you'll notice that the objectives are broken down into three categories: skills, knowledge, and attitudes. Skills probably can be defined, at least in one way, as those things that will be helpful to you as you proceed with your work as a seminary student. These are the kinds of skills that you want to grow in. Knowledge, that may be very practically defined as the kinds of things that you will probably be tested on, and that will come back, hopefully, to bless you. So how to pass the course, get the necessary knowledge. And attitudes has to do, I think, basically with how does this enrich my spiritual life? Is this something that is going to be an integral part of my personhood, my being? So obviously, as we go to the skills, you want to grow in your ability to understand and interpret the New Testament as you read it. Secondly, you want to see the unity of the New Testament. As you look at these 27 books, you will see that they all come together in presenting a unified witness to the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And there is no contradiction there. These books dovetail, and it's a beautiful symphony of the meaning of the life and ministry of Jesus for us. And thirdly, simply growing in understanding and knowing the teachings as they're found in the various books, the Gospels, the Acts, the Epistles. Now, as far as, oops, I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. I was already in B3. Yeah, sorry. Let's go back to A3, making use of bibliographic resources. Now, I'll have to tell you this, that in light of the fact that we only have 2 weeks together, this is one thing that we probably will do in just a beginning sort of way. But there will be a brief paper that I will be seeing a little bit more about it shortly that will indeed involve your getting somewhat acquainted with the research facilities of the library. And I feel I need to at least have you know where some of those resources are and being able to put them to use. So yes, we hopefully will grow in the use of those resources. Getting on to B, the knowledge section. All right, that's pretty obvious there. So you can look this over on your own. On the attitudes, obviously the first one, gratitude to God for what He's done for us, and the value of the New Testament for our own personal Christian growth, and finally the business of being equipped to be a witness of the gospel of Jesus Christ to others. Now, as we move on to the procedure section, I don't need to say a lot about attendance. Probably 2 words would cover it: be here. And that's because we move very quickly, and the ability to take notes and to retain information will be a valuable resource when you get around to doing exams, of which we will have 2 in this course. Point number B, the epistolary exposition, we'll talk about on the next couple of pages where that comes up, and corollary notes. That has to do with keeping up with your reading assignments, with your study guide, with taking notes in class, and so that will also be a learning resource. Finally, how do we get graded? The evaluation procedure. I do, for the matter of grades, count the midterm and the qualifier, each in the same weighting, 45% each. For the MA students, there's a little bit more rigid requirement, which I think you've heard about already, and if you have any question, you can talk to me about it. But the expectation is that you have a minimum of a 70-degree average, and hopefully we can do better than that minimum. There's also a 10% epistolary exposition grade. In other words, what you do for the second week when you report on the one epistle that you will identify with, you will be given some credit for that as well, and that will bless you as well as the class. More detail on how to do that in a minute. Any questions on the first page? As we move on to the next page, you will see the study resources that we need to use, and we have kept it simple. Basically, your Bible is the key, and the reason we chose this is primarily because it's got all those great notes that are produced by people who have taught here at this seminary in the past. And if you have any other Bible, I say fine, whatever works for you, that's fine too. I personally, for this course, need 2 Bibles because this has the notes we'll be referring to on occasion. I use this one because, as you can see, I've used it since the Middle Ages. Once you get a good Bible and you put your notes in, you don't want to get rid of it. So I will be using both of them from time to time. And by the way, is an RSV edition. This is an NIV, as you know, but the notes in here are excellent. And most of you already know this, but Concordia Publishing House is in the process right now of coming up with new notes for the ESV, the English Standard Version, which is very much like the RSV in terms of its fidelity to the literal text of the Greek New Testament, more so than the NIV. And we will discover that very quickly when we get to Mark's Gospel, for example, how they sometimes sort of get to be a little bit more colloquial than the literal text. So that's the lectionary series that we're using in the churches already, in many of the churches today, based on the ESV. So that's going to be coming out from CPH soon. We don't know exactly when the date will be, but I know they're working on it. So someday you may make this your main Bible and use it for 40 years as I did, or 50 years as I did with that one. But you figure it out. Okay, then the assignment schedule. You can draw an X through that part of the page because this revised schedule takes care of it. Okay? This is the updated one. And also you will notice that my office hours are by appointment, basically. That's because I live off campus. And I'll be glad to stay after class to meet with anybody who needs it or at a mutually agreeable time. And my phone number is as on this new sheet, not as on the old sheet, because I also changed email addresses, and that's listed on this revised sheet at the bottom. So you can get rid of the initial document. And why do we have 2 versions? Very simply this. About 3 months ago, I was required to get my notes in to the bookstore so they can get it done in timely fashion for summer school. And in those 3 months, that's a long time, I did change phone numbers, I did change email address. And then, of course, last week I also needed to make some adjustments after I found out how the qualifier looked. So that explains why we have a revision. 3 months is a long time for the status quo, and you can't stay with the status quo too long, as one of our political candidates keeps reminding us we need change, whenever that is desirable. I guess that's been around for many decades, right? Okay, and that brings us to Appendix J, which is a much longer one. Appendix J, I am happy to say, is a product of Dr. Raj's work some years ago when he was a prof at Mequon or Milwaukee. I'm not sure what it was in those days, but in Wisconsin, right? You know where it is. The site, the future site, later this week, the St. Louis Rams are going to be training there on the Concordia University campus in Mequon. How many of you knew that? Okay. So, all right. Concordia and St. Louis are drawing closer together in so many ways, even in football. Let's go then to Appendix J. And here I want to dwell a little bit more at length. And I want to refer you to page 15. I'm not going to follow the order exactly as Dr. Raj set it up because I want to do it a little bit more in sequence, starting with first things and moving down to New Testament times instead of going the other direction. So if you'll turn to the bottom of, I guess it's the second page, it's page number 15, where it says the Jewish state. The Jewish state. This is very valuable connecting material between the Old Testament times and the New Testament times, and has some bearing in helping us to understand how the church could grow as rapidly as it did when we make the connections between Old and New Testament. So then, starting with what is printed here, as some of you remember from your previous studies of Old Testament, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. They carried off a lot of the citizens and destroyed the city of Jerusalem in the year 586. That usually is referred to as the Babylonian captivity then, that came out of the dreadful invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. Then synagogue worship was initiated in Babylon because the temple was no longer available. And they developed a worship format that is still in practice and use today, and a worship format that even our churches to some degree have copied, like, for example, the reading of the scriptures and the commentating on it and the singing of hymns and so forth. So that developed out of the exile. Let me add a few things before we go to the next page, because there is a little link here that should be put in addition, and it pertains to how did the children of Israel get out of Babylon. In the year 538, Cyrus, the king of Persia, liberated the Jews when he conquered Babylon, and he allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland, and some of them did. Most of them didn't, because they found their life in Babylon was much more economically advantaged than they had in their scraggly hills of their homeland. But those who were really religious went back and took advantage of this opportunity, and thus ended the Babylonian captivity. And during the time of the Persian period, which lasted about 200 years, until the time of Alexander, who ushered in the Greek period, notice about 200 years roughly for the Persian period, several things happened that were quite significant for what we refer to, well, I'm stealing the words of St. Paul from Galatians chapter 4, the fullness of the time. You know that wonderful passage, Galatians 4, verse 4, I think it says, when the fullness of the time had come, and here I'm quoting King James, because that's what I memorized when I was a kid, right? So you memorize what you memorize when you're a kid. When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. The fullness of the time. When was the world ready for the coming of the Messiah? Well, in this period, the time of the Persians, several things happened. First of all, there is a matter of them getting to go back and to reclaim at least some of the land. Later they would reclaim more of it, but they made the beginning at this particular point. One of their first emphases was to restore the temple, and that took a while. They didn't get it done right away. It wasn't until the year 515 when they finally completed the temple, and there was great joy, even though there was also great sadness, because this temple wasn't anything like the original magnificent structure that King Solomon had built centuries previously. But the joy of, again, having their house of worship restored. As time goes on, the time of Nehemiah, the city gets restored, and the approximate time for that is the year 444 BC. And so Jerusalem once again gets an identity which, well, as you know, many of the Old Testament prophecies are of a sort to suggest that great things pertaining to salvation history would come to pass in and beyond Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be a focal point of salvation history. So, at the time of Nehemiah, the city is restored, the walls are rebuilt, and soon after that, with the coming of Ezra, the law is once again rediscovered, and focus on the scripture and the law is once again highlighted. That's all during the Persian period. What's the significant thing in the time of Alexander for the fullness of the time? Well, as you know, he had his passion to conquer the world and to make it Greek. And how is this a blessing for the time of our Lord? Well, by the time that Jesus was born, even in Israel, Greek was a common language. And we'll see how that happened in time. I mean, after all, Hebrew was ingrained for centuries previously, and the Jews resisted any of these modern things like Greek customs, Greek language, but it was literally forced upon them during the time of the, well, as on the next page indicates, the time of the Seleucids. So let's move on to the next page, page 16, where it states at the top of the page, during the Persian Greek periods, the kings ceased to be, as known previously. The prophetic office likewise dwindled, disappeared, but the priesthood then became the strong religious focus. And sadly, the priesthood usually turned out to be rather political. And this is what Jesus has a problem with when he comes in his ministry, with the politicization of the priesthood, the way the Sadducees had changed the spiritual center of the priesthood to kind of a political focus. Moving on then to the next column under B, the Ptolemies, you will notice that Alexander's time was short because, well, he died prematurely. And so we have his empire divided into several parts. The two most significant parts for New Testament history, of course, are the parts that the Ptolemies controlled, and later, well, Israel was controlled later after the Ptolemies by the Seleucids. The Ptolemies, of course, came out of Egypt. They controlled the Holy Land, which is kind of a tug-of-war thing going on between the country in the south, Egypt, the country to the north, Syria. And at first, for over about a century and a quarter, the Ptolemies controlled. And during this time, the significant thing for salvation history is that the Hebrew Scriptures was translated into Greek. The Septuagint, LXX for short, came to pass during this time. And the significance for the apostolic age was that when the apostles went everywhere preaching the good news of Jesus, the people already had the Hebrew Scriptures in the universal language of Alexander, the Greek, okay? And thus, when the apostles could relate to the Scriptures as being fulfilled, they knew what they were talking about, because in many circles those were available because of the Septuagint, which came out of the Ptolemaic period in Alexandria, because so many Jews had gone to Alexandria, because Egypt was a much more cosmopolitan place, in Alexandria in particular, than it had been the case in the barren country of Israel. So it turned out to be a blessing, this Ptolemaic period. The Seleucid period was very stormy, and it is a very short period, thankfully, about a 30-year period. When you read the word Seleucid, you read the word Syria. These are the Syrians who controlled the land, and we won't go into the history a great deal except to say that the Seleucid contribution to the state of Israel was a very hard to swallow one. They forced the people of Israel to become Greek in more ways than they cared. Not only in language, culture, they also tried to impose a religion, and they tried to destroy the religion of the people of Israel. And this is where the Maccabees come onto the scene after, of course, the temple is defiled in the year 167. That's usually the date given, 168, 167, for the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem and the rise of the Maccabean family and the Jewish religious rebels going to the hills and fighting for the liberation and finally getting it. And nevertheless, during this period, the land became enculturated, and the blessing for the apostolic age was this land too, where Jesus' apostles would be with him. They would be bilingual, and they would give us the New Testament Scriptures in the universal language that Alexander had brought from Europe into Asia. All right, the long and short of it is, this was followed by the liberation of the temple and what we call the Feast of Dedication in the Fourth Gospel. Today is more commonly known as Hanukkah. Hanukkah Feast of Dedication, same thing. John 10 talks about the Feast of Dedication. Jesus came to Jerusalem during that time, and he has some important things to say about the meaning of it. We'll see that when we get to John's Gospel, hopefully. So there is a liberation by the Maccabees, and from the year 142 to the year 63, there is a time of independence where the Jews are free from all foreign domination, about an 80-year period. But you see, it doesn't last. Because they got into squabbles, the time of independence was also a time when they had huge struggles between their own peoples. The parties of the Pharisees and the Sadducees arose at this particular time, and there were familial struggles that when the Romans came to the east, they invited Pompey, the Roman leader, to come and help them settle their problems, and you know the rest is history. The Romans never take over a territory and give it back, and from the year 63 on, the Romans controlled. So 63 on is the Roman period, and through the time of the New Testament, the Romans are in charge of the Holy Land. Now this has certain advantages for the Jews because the Romans were people of law and order, and we'll see that especially when we get to the book of Acts. We see it already in the trial of Jesus under Pilate. Pilate wanted to do justice. Of course, ultimately he denied justice. But in the case of Paul, he was regularly given justice when he was falsely accused. Romans had law and order. They had great roads. Their roads enabled the rapid propagation of the gospel throughout the Roman world. The apostles could travel. The sea lanes had been cleared of pirates. There was a time of peace. A 200-year Pax Romana allowed the apostles to travel far and wide to propagate the gospel. And so the Roman period was, quote, a part of the fullness of the time when God sent forth his Son. Now, moving on then to the middle of page 16, you have a reference to the Herods. The first of the Herodian dynasty was called Herod the Great, or Herod the First. And what made him great, I think, was the fact that he was a great builder. He built great buildings and in this way sought to ingratiate himself to the Jews. But what made him not so great was that he was a very jealous man. And anybody who might be a potential rival to the throne heads off. He even killed some of the members of his own family. And there was kind of a common joke about Herod that it was a lot safer to be his pig than his son. And there was a kind of a Greek play on words there, which I won't bother you with. But Herod had heard that when he died, there would be no weeping in Jerusalem. And he said, I'll fix that. And so he imprisoned the sons of the leading family in an imprisonment near Jericho with the instruction that when he died, they would all be killed. Now, of course, he died, and he was buried at the Herodium near Bethlehem. It's still there today. And when he died, all these sons were released, and there was no weeping at his death. Well, so he was the original April Fool. It says here that he died on April the 1st in the year 4 BC. Well, the joke was on him because nobody wept at his death, despite his attempt to really make it happen. Now, who are some of the Herods that followed him? They are mentioned in the New Testament. Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas are mentioned there in number 13, 14, and 15 in the page, respectively. Archelaus was in charge of Judea, the part of the country that included Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and where, of course, Joseph and Mary decided not to live because it was too dangerous to live where he was. They had escaped the first Herod, and they didn't want to take a chance on this one, so they moved to Galilee where, well, Antipas, point number 15, was the tetrarch, a ruler of a fourth part of the country. And by the way, after Herod the king died, the Romans were smart enough not to give the title of king to any of his sons. They gave them different titles, like, for example, Herod Antipas was called Herod the Tetrarch. Oh, yeah, he was also called king by some people, but the Romans didn't call him that. And then the third son who got some land was Philip, who had the lands to the north of the Sea of Galilee and to the east, including the great city of Caesarea Philippi. And it wasn't always called Caesarea Philippi. He named it. He renamed it. He called it Caesarea in honor of the emperor. He called it Philippi in honor of himself. Okay. So we'll hear more about that when we get to Matthew 16, hopefully tomorrow, Caesarea Philippi, where Peter made his great confession. Antipas ruled the part of the country where Jesus would do most of his public ministry, namely the region around the Sea of Galilee, the territory of Galilee, and the territory across the Jordan, which is called Perea, stretching down to the Dead Sea. Okay, moving to the next page. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Agrippa I is mentioned in Acts chapter 12. He is the next generation of Herods. After Archelaus was deposed and the Romans sent procurators or governors, like Pontius Pilate was a procurator, after many years passed, the Romans once again put Judea under a Herod, and this is Agrippa, and Agrippa I, who was the ruler of the region Galilee, not Galilee, but Judea and Samaria, but in that time it was all called Judea. And he was responsible for the killing of James and the intention to kill Peter. Acts 12 tells us how Peter escaped by virtue of the angel's intervention. And then Agrippa II, again, only one real significant mention, and that's in Acts 25-26, where Paul appears before him shortly before he's sent to Rome, where he would get a true hearing. All righty. I think the section H, G and H, talk about the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. Jesus had predicted this would happen within a generation normally considered to be 40 years. When Jesus spoke this was approximately 30 AD when it happened. 70 AD, exactly one generation. As predicted, Jerusalem fell, conquered by the Romans after the Jews had rebelled. And then a word about the rule of procurators. Like I said, the south part of the country, Judea, was a very cantankerous region. The Jews were always rebelling, it seemed, and the Romans put in charge a person who would be directly responsible to the emperor for Judea. And this would be a person like Pontius Pilate, who reigned for 10 years during the time when Jesus was crucified. You know, he comes into play there. And we even talk about him on Sundays in church when we say he suffered under Pontius Pilate. I've often had kind of a secret wish that our second article might have room for a few more words, like he suffered under High Priest Caiaphas and under Pontius Pilate. But we were being very kind to the Jews here by not mentioning Caiaphas. We do mention Pontius Pilate, who finally pronounced the death penalty, but he also suffered plenty under Caiaphas, as you know from the Gospels. Okay, enough of that, I suppose. Let's flip back now to page 14, same document. And perhaps we should say a little bit about the Roman rule that was in effect at the time of Jesus. We don't have to say a whole lot there. Some of you who studied Roman history might be interested in the fact that in line 2 there's a little typo. Instead of 735, it should be 753 when Rome was founded. But, you know, Rome's government over the centuries changed from the time of having kings, a monarchy, to the time of a republic, to the time of an empire. And the first of the emperors, where we're really interested, is Augustus, Caesar Augustus. His real name was Octavian, but they gave him the title Augustus, and it stuck. And all the other emperors, we're told by historians, were also called Augustus as a title, not as a name, but the title stuck with Octavian. He's always remembered, certainly also in the New Testament, as Caesar Augustus, Luke chapter 2. And he was the one who was the emperor, the first of the emperors at the birth of Jesus, as we know from Luke chapter 2. Tiberius has this claim to fame, that he was the emperor at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And the next one that might be one you'd like to remember, by the way, there's another typo there under Caligula. Instead of 14 to 37, it should be 37 to 41. So you may want to correct that. And then again, if you don't want to, nobody's hurt. Going on to Claudius. Acts chapter 18 speaks about the expulsion from Rome of two very devout Christians named Priscilla and Aquila. Acts 18, Paul came to Corinth, and there he met with these fellow tent makers, Priscilla and Aquila, and they were with him for quite a few stints. Later in Ephesus, they were with him. Later, when he writes from Rome, he mentions them. That's the significant contribution of Claudius. One little thing, he expelled Christians from Rome, and some of Paul's co-workers were in Corinth because of that. Then finally, Nero on this page. He is the gentleman, oh my, I use that word loosely. He is the man, the beast, not a gentleman, who persecuted the Christians after the burning of Rome, made them the scapegoat, later is responsible for the death of Peter and Paul, both in Rome, somewhere between 64 to 68 A.D. Well, there's a few other emperors. I don't need to bother you with them all, but do list at least one name on the bottom of the page. You write in the name Domitian, D-O-M-I-T-I-A-N. Domitian is significant in the New Testament because he took seriously one thing that had already been in effect for many reigns previous. He took seriously the fact that the emperor is deified by the Romans. He is made into God, and he is to be worshipped as a god. Augustus was already deified, and that same thing was also an honor given to succeeding emperors. But Domitian carried it much further. He carried it to the point where Christians were actually persecuted if they didn't give this pinch of incense to the emperor at least once a year and proclaim him to be Lord and God. And that's the background for the book of Revelation, where John writes to the persecuted Christians of the churches of Asia who were suffering for their faith. Some of them had already been killed, but at least a lot of them were suffering and discriminated against. They couldn't buy and sell in the marketplace, as we see at the end of chapter 13, where we have this infamous 666 figure. And that was because of Domitian. He persecuted the Christians toward the end of the first century when St. John was writing, and he wrote the book of Revelation addressing the issue to the Christians there, urging them to be steadfast in the faith, and that they will finally overcome, and God will see to it that they will get the victory despite whatever they're suffering in this time. Okay, I think we can skip over to page 19, pick up a thing or two there, if you don't mind. The one thing I want to pick up on page 19, or is it several, is in the middle of the page, emperor worship. We talked about that already, but you might just want to check it. And by the time of Domitian, it was regarded to be treasonous if you didn't worship the emperor, at least minimally, along with the other Greek gods, and Christians couldn't do that. Then let's flip over to page 20. There's one thing I'd like to touch on here, and please understand I'm not trying to disrespect all this other good information, but I'm trying to pick out what I perceive to be most important from what they expect me to give you in this course. And that's the entry under E2, Gnosticism. Gnosticism, simply translated, has to do with the Greek idea of gnosis, or knowledge. Knowledge, having the right knowledge. Right knowledge of key passwords is that which provides for the possibility of your salvation. That's basically what they believed. And it's not actually mentioned by name, but it seems to be in the background of a number of the New Testament writings that the various writers seem to address that issue to a degree, some more, some less. So we'll meet it on occasion as we move along the next couple of weeks. Basically, the Gnostics believe that all matter is evil and good is only in the spirit world. And ultimately, to achieve salvation, one needs to transcend the material world and be connected at death with the spirit world. But of course, there are difficult issues that might keep one from doing that. There are all these eons floating around in the universe, the intermediate spirits that would struggle against you. And Paul needs to write to tell the Christians, I believe it's to the Colossians, that they should not be worried about the principalities and powers and the rulers of darkness of this evil age, but to trust in Jesus Christ as sufficient. And you don't need to know all the particular passwords that the elitist Gnostics are saying. If you don't have these passwords, you can't be saved. What you need to know is Jesus Christ, because he is the source of our salvation. And knowing him is sufficiency, and Colossians particularly hits home on that concept. So as a result of Gnosticism, two great evils arose. One was to suggest that because the body is matter, you have to sort of crucify the body and live the life of an ascetic. And by really putting down the body, you earn virtue. Asceticism is one of the aberrations that some Gnostics held to. The opposite aberration was called libertinism, which the logic goes something like this. Because the body is matter, and everybody knows all matter is evil, you can do anything you want, because someday, at the point of your salvation, what happens to that bit of garbage called the human body is all going to be left behind anyway, and the spirit will be liberated. So do what you want. It makes no difference. Live life to the hilt. And never mind being a moral person. So those are two aberrations which were the natural outgrowths of Gnosticism. Now there are other important things on this page, but again, that's probably the one that impacts our New Testament study the most. So let's go on. Page 21 on item, Appendix J as we continue. We've already addressed item C about the temple. We've talked about its restoration in the year 515 or 516 as it's mentioned here, and about, later after it was polluted in the year 168 or 167, whatever date you're going to go with, and restored in the year 164. Then we had the temple to which the Lord came. And it's called the second temple because the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. And at the time of Jesus, we see him saying that that temple would again be destroyed, the second temple, and he does not talk about it being rebuilt, contrary to what you read some of these folks saying in their religious books that are coming out, the second chance type of writers. Jesus never talks about the temple in Jerusalem being rebuilt again. In the time of the prophets, yes, and it was rebuilt after the prophets had said it would be. Jesus pointed them to a higher temple. He said, destroy this temple, referring to his body, and I will raise it on the third day. And you come to the question, what really is the temple of God? The temple of God is where he meets his people. That's the theological construct of the temple, where God and his people come together. And where do they come together more fully than through the person of Jesus? The incarnate one is the one who brought people truly into the presence of God and into a relationship with God. And then Paul draws upon this concept of temple when he writes variously, especially to the Corinthians. He mentions this several times, that he says, your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And how is that possible? Well, if God is within you, and of course Romans speaks over and over again of Christ in you, being in Christ, if God is within you, then indeed you are the repository of his presence because you have allowed his Spirit to indwell you. So this is the theological concept that Jesus, tried to inculcate in his apostles, and they shared it in terms as they wrote their various epistles. The synagogue, well, we talked about that a little bit, and as we said earlier, this is the invention of necessity at the time of the exile when they were separated from their place of bringing sacrifice at the temple. 10 or more Jewish adults coming together for worship could constitute a synagogue, and even to this day, in many circles, that rule is still being followed. And today, when sacrifice cannot be brought at the temple, well, the synagogue is the Jewish replacement. And Paul deals with this idea of a continuing sacrifice, but not necessarily in the building. It's in the latter part of Romans. We'll be taking this up early next week. And he says, Be transformed from this world, not conformed to it. Let your body be a living sacrifice to the Lord. In other words, live your life in such a way as to put yourself under the will of God. Submit to His will. That's the kind of sacrifice with which God is well pleased. So do we really need the rebuilding of this temple on Mount Zion today? Well, some people say yes, but the Bible doesn't say that. And that's an interesting concept. The sacred year at the bottom of the page, we'll deal more with that when we get to John's Gospel in a few days. So you might want to save that. The key events, of course, are the Passover, the Pentecost, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Tabernacles, Feast of Hanukkah. We'll have more to say that when we get to John's Gospel. Many of these festivals are still being celebrated today in the church. Of course, Passover is celebrated at the time of which great Christian festival? Got it, Easter. Easter. Pentecost, Old Testament Pentecost is celebrated with what great festival day? The Christian Pentecost, right? We kept the same name, didn't we? What about Feast of Tabernacles? Do we still celebrate that today? When God tented with His people in the wilderness, when His presence was among them, as they traveled for 40 years in the tabernacle, did God ever tabernacle with His people, the Christians, the church? Have you read John 1, verse 14 in the Greek NIV? The Word became flesh, and skenao is your verb. He pitched His tent. He tabernacled among us. Through the incarnation of Jesus, we have the concept of the tabernacling. Of course, now today, when we think of the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, which comes celebrated at Christmas time, that's not really the total equivalent of Christmas, our other great holiday, of the three great ones we commemorate today, besides other holidays, obviously. But the concept of tabernacles probably most closely approximates the concept of Christmas as we have it today, where we celebrate the incarnation, namely God being among us through the person of Jesus. Well, more on some of these things later. Okay, we can flip over the next pages. You'll hear a lot more about hermeneutics, page 23, when you take the course, so I will not speak on that topic, except that I pledge you I will keep the rules of hermeneutics as we try to work together. And the date of Jesus' birth, again, suffice it to say 5 BC, thereabouts. That's close enough, because the later calendar maker's mistake when he set up the calendar several centuries after the birth of Christ. We don't have to, spend a lot of time going through all those details, but you may. It's a very interesting little essay. Page 26. These 2 pages that follow are a really fine little summary of some of the high points of some of the epistles we'll be taking up next week. And again, save that for future reference.